Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're putting on our thickest philosophical armor
We definitely need it.
because we're diving into an idea that is genuinely challenging. I mean, it pushes against the deepest human instincts of survival, of hope.
Yeah.
We're looking at philosophical pessimism taken to its absolute, existential limit.
And that limit is what our source material labels pro-mortalism. It's a framework that really requires you to abandon conventional views on the value of life itself.
Right.
It argues that suffering is so profound, so guaranteed, that the immediate end of life isn't a tragedy, but, well, a moral imperative.
So our mission today is to unpack this thing, pro-mortalism, this belief that it's better for people to die sooner rather than later.
A tough one.
Yeah, we're going to analyze its motivations, look at its maybe surprising variations, and crucially, wrestle with the powerful ethical criticisms it faces. We need to clearly define this difficult philosophical space, not to endorse it, but to understand the sort of absolute logic that might be at its heart.
Okay, so let's just jump right to the core claim then. Pro-mortalism asserts that ending existing lives now, that's the single most effective way to prevent future suffering.
Wow. Yeah.
It basically takes the moral goal of minimizing pain and executes it with this kind of clinical, immediate efficiency.
That concept, this preference for immediate death, it makes it sound related to other, maybe better known forms of philosophical pessimism.
It does, yeah.
We really need to place this idea on the intellectual map.
Mm-hmm.
How does pro-mortalism stack up against its cousins, like antinatalism and extinctionism?
Yeah, it's really important we draw some clear lines here. Otherwise, these concepts can just blur together into, general gloom.
Right.
Think of it maybe as a family tree of existential termination ideas, and pro-mortalism is definitely the most radical member of that family.
Okay, let's start with antinatalism. This is probably the one most listeners might have heard of.
Sure. Antinatalism focuses purely on reproduction. Its whole thesis is basically don't start life.
Simple enough.
It aims to prevent any new individuals from coming into existence because, according to the view, life is, on balance, a harm. It's purely an ethics of prevention. Importantly, it doesn't advocate for harming people who already exist.
Okay, so it deals just with creating future beings. If antinatalism is don't create, what's extinctionism then?
Extinctionism is a bit broader. It argues that life, specifically human life as a species, should eventually just disappear.
Oh.
Well, it advocates for humanity collectively stopping reproduction. This would lead to a kind of slow, natural, eventual disappearance, like a species-wide fade-out, you could say.
I see. So it's a long-term goal, sort of a species retirement plan.
Yeah, something like that.
And pro-mortalism. Why do you say it's the most extreme?
Because pro-mortalism targets the present. Right now. It doesn't wait for some natural extinction, and it's not satisfied with just preventing future births. Its premise is basically existing individuals right now would be better off dead than continuing to live. It shifts the whole ethical focus from preventing life to actively arguing for the termination of current lives. Why? To stop the suffering inherent in them.
That emphasis on immediate termination. That's what makes it so jarring, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But how does this view differentiate itself from supporting something like euthanasia or, the widely accepted right to die framework? They sound similar on the surface.
That's a really critical distinction, and it's where the big philosophical leap happens. Euthanasia and the right to die, they're almost always conditional. Meaning they support voluntary death, applied specifically in cases of active, severe, terminal, or just unbearable suffering. It's a choice driven by an existing pain crisis, a specific situation.
Okay, so it's like pain management through individual choice.
Exactly. Pro-mortalism, though, it generalizes that preference for death to everyone. It claims immediate death is preferable for all individuals, regardless of their current emotional state, their health, their wealth, whatever.
Yeah. But why? Just because bad things might happen?
Essentially, yes.
Sure.
Because the potential for future suffering is seen as guaranteed simply by being alive. The fact that you might feel joy today becomes irrelevant, because the certainty, as they see it, that you will experience loss, decay, and eventual anguish tomorrow, that outweighs any temporary good.
Okay, let's try to unpack the core philosophical engine driving this conclusion that sooner is better. It must be rooted in a really deep, suffering-focused ethics that basically discounts positive human experience entirely.
It absolutely is. It's entirely built on the perceived inevitability of suffering.
Right.
The pro-mortalist framework views life almost like a contract that guarantees pain. Guaranteed illness, guaranteed frustration, guaranteed loss of loved ones, and eventually a guaranteed, often difficult death.
No, so every extra moment you live.
It's just adding digits to your cumulative suffering tally, in their view. Extending life isn't seen as a gift of more experience, but more like compounding the debt of future misery.
How do they justify that, sort of mathematically, that the absence of suffering is the supreme moral good above all else?
They often lean on a pretty powerful philosophical tool. You might have heard of it, the asymmetry argument. It's popular in antinatalist circles, but pro-mortalists kind of extend it.
Okay.
This logic tries to prove that while existence is always inherently a risk, non-existence is a guaranteed win, ethically speaking.
Okay, walk us through the exact premises of that asymmetry. This feels like the key to understanding the whole philosophy.
Right, it works basically like this. First premise, the presence of pain is bad. Pretty uncontroversial.
Agreed.
Second, the presence of pleasure is good.
Okay.
Again, seems straightforward.
Yeah.
But here's the critical third premise. The absence of suffering is good. Even if no one exists to experience that good state, it's just inherently better for suffering not to exist, like a universal state of peace.
Okay, yeah, a world without pain seems better than one with it. Makes sense.
But then the fourth premise is the kicker. The absence of pleasure is not bad, because there's no being who is being deprived of that pleasure. A life that never existed can't mourn the joy it missed out on.
Okay.
Therefore, non-existence is asymmetrical. It prevents the absolute bad, which is suffering, without causing any corresponding absolute harm, like missing out on pleasure.
That is, yeah, that's a neat but pretty devastating trick of logic.
It is.
So if you accept that framework, then the pro-mortalist just applies it to existing life.
Right.
Since living guarantees future suffering, the absolute bad, and death guarantees the absence of suffering, the absolute good, death becomes morally superior.
Precisely. The sooner you achieve that state of guaranteed absence of suffering, which is death, the better off the individual is considered to be.
Which leads to that incredibly paradoxical conclusion you mentioned earlier.
Right, that for the committed pro-mortalist, the desire for immediate death is framed as the purest, most rational act of compassion for all sentient beings.
Compassion achieved through termination. That's just a radical inversion of how we normally think about morality.
Complete.
What's also fascinating, though, is that even within this really dark framework, there are apparently internal gradations. It's not just one single unified call for action.
That's right, yeah. Our sources actually lay out three main variations, showing that the, let's say, intensity of the proposed solution can differ quite a bit.
Okay, give us the most uncompromising version first. The deep end.
That would be universal pro-mortalism. This is the full throttle version, no holding back. It holds that all humans, and potentially all sentient beings, from people down to pets, maybe even further, would be genuinely better off dead immediately.
Wow.
It's the unconditional application of that asymmetry argument to literally everything that feels.
That requires just total conviction, and that suffering always outweighs joy calculation.
Yeah.
What about those who maybe tap the brakes a little?
Okay, then we get conditional pro-mortalism. This view limits the preference for death to specific, usually acute scenarios. Well, they'd argue death is preferable only when someone faces, say, a terminal illness, maybe severe, untreatable depression, or just ongoing medically determined, unbearable suffering.
Wow.
So, in essence, they're sort of generalizing the logic we see in end-of-life care discussions, but applying it to a slightly broader, though still conditional, scope of misery.
So it's still advocating for death as preferable in some cases, but it requires a very high threshold of existing pain first, not just the potential for future pain.
Exactly. And then the final, softer variation.
Which is?
The gentlest version is called soft pro-mortalism. Now, this doesn't necessarily advocate for active termination at all. Instead, it suggests people should simply accept death earlier, maybe refrain from desperately clinging to life at all costs through extreme medical interventions.
So more about acceptance.
Yeah, it's more a call to embrace our finitude, maybe to avoid artificially extending the suffering that can come with extreme old age or chronic illness, less interventionist.
It's important context, too, to realize that this kind of existential despair isn't entirely a modern invention, right? These ideas, even if not fully packaged as pro-mortalism, seem to have deep intellectual roots.
Oh, absolutely. The intellectual lineage goes back centuries. I mean, take someone like Arthur Schopenhauer.
Right, the classic pessimist.
Exactly. His whole philosophy was saturated with the idea that existence itself is inherently painful, just this relentless cycle of desire and frustration. He famously viewed death not really as an end, but as a kind of welcome release from the will to live. His despair really created fertile ground for these kinds of concepts.
And you also see philosophical parallels, perhaps, in some world religions that seek an ultimate release from the cycle of life.
Yes, definitely. Look at certain interpretations of Buddhist philosophy, for instance. While the primary goal isn't death per se, the concept of nirvana,
The ultimate goal.
right, the ultimate cessation of suffering and the escape from the cycle of painful rebirth, samsara, well, that can be viewed through a pro-mortalist-like lens. It represents an end goal centered on the absolute final stopping of participation in a world seen as inherently filled with suffering.
So it connects that profound spiritual longing for peace with this philosophical drive for non-existence, in a way.
In a way, yes. And in more modern times, you have thinkers like David Benatar, whose antinatalism provides a lot of the rational mechanics we discuss.
With the asymmetry argument.
Exactly. But he doesn't necessarily take that final pro-mortalist step himself. The logic is laid out, even if the person who laid it out refuses to make the final jump into advocating for ending existing lives.
And that jump, that's the difference between a philosophical thought experiment and an actual policy recommendation, isn't it?
It absolutely is, which is where we really need to transition now to the criticisms.
Okay, yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting because we have to introduce the counter-arguments, the reasons this view stays firmly, on the academic fringe. Mainstream ethics finds this position deeply flawed and for some crucial reasons. What's the fundamental, immediate objection?
Well, the primary counterpoint is usually called the value of life objection. It's pretty straightforward.
Yes, says.
That pro-mortalism operates with extreme tunnel vision, focusing only on the negative possibilities of life. Critics argue quite strongly that life contains massive, undeniable goods. The capacity for joy, creativity, love, beauty, meaningful connection, personal achievement.
All the things that make life worth living for most people.
Exactly. And by advocating for termination, the philosophy just completely ignores or dismisses these profound positive utilities.
It's like a philosophical algorithm that just excludes all the positive inputs.
Yeah.
But beyond simply ignoring the good parts, there are some, frankly, terrifying practical implications if this logic were ever normalized, right?
Oh, absolutely. That brings us squarely to the practical ethics challenge. This is the morally alarming potential outcome.
Go on.
If we actually accept the premise that immediate death is universally preferable because it eliminates future suffering, well, the floodgates could open.
How so?
The philosophy, as outlined in the sources we looked at, could logically justify not just, say, voluntary mass suicide, but potentially even mass involuntary euthanasia, all framed as a compassionate act to save people from their future suffering.
That's the point where theoretical logic just slams headfirst into moral responsibility, into basic human rights.
Precisely. It bypasses pretty much every established human right we've built over centuries. You'd be substituting individual autonomy, the right to choose for oneself, with this cold, utilitarian calculation of predicted suffering.
Which seems impossible to actually calculate anyway.
Well, yes. And that leads directly to another issue, the consistency within the argument itself. We have to talk about that classic philosophical jab, the paradox of the arguer.
Ah, yes. If immediate death is genuinely the best moral outcome, why are the proponents of pro-mortalism still alive? Why are they spending their time writing books or arguing the point?
Exactly.
The very act of choosing to continue living, to eat, sleep, write, breathe it, fundamentally contradicts the belief that immediate termination is the superior state.
So critics argue.
Critics argue this demonstrates an innate, maybe biologically hardwired valuation of life that the philosopher just can't logically overcome, even if their own math tells them they should.
Yeah, it's hard to take the stance completely seriously if the advocate themselves seems to be proving that the value of life, or at least the instinct for survival, is ultimately stronger than their own logic.
It does raise questions. And finally, there's the undeniable real-world concern about the potential for harm.
This seems crucial.
We really have to highlight the ethical burden here. Promoting a philosophy that, glorifies or actively advocates for immediate death, regardless of the theoretical compassion involved, it runs an enormous risk.
The risk of what?
Of negatively influencing vulnerable individuals. For people struggling with severe mental health issues, perhaps depression or suicidal ideation, This kind of framework could seem to validate and even encourage destructive behavior. It's an intellectual exercise with potentially intensely dangerous real-world consequences.
So, bringing this all back to the contemporary landscape, where does pro-mortalism ultimately sit today? Is anyone actually arguing for this seriously?
Well, because of its extreme nature and its direct conflict with such fundamental human values, it remains almost entirely a theoretical or, fringe philosophical stance. It's very rarely, if ever, considered a legitimate policy platform in any kind of modern ethical discourse.
It just clashes headlong with the dominant social framework of our time, doesn't it? With humanism.
Precisely. Mainstream humanism is fundamentally rooted in valuing survival, in maximizing flourishing, in improving the quality of life we have here on Earth. Pro-mortalism just rejects those tenets wholesale. It views efforts at improvement as merely delaying the inevitable suffering.
So where does this challenging idea actually surface in relevant contemporary discussions then, if not in policy?
It tends to surface primarily in those really intense academic corners, the ones devoted to suffering-focused ethics, where people are rigorously trying to calculate the true moral weight and impact of pain.
Okay.
It also features sometimes in certain areas of advanced animal welfare debates and deep environmental ethics, where thinkers explore whether bringing any sentient being into a world full of potential harm is inherently unethical. It kind of helps calibrate the outer boundaries of moral pessimism.
Okay, let's try to review the key takeaway for our listener, just synthesizing all these distinctions we've made.
Sure, I think the core takeaway is this. Pro-mortalism is the belief that dying sooner is morally preferable to continuing life. It's the most extreme expression of philosophical pessimism because it moves beyond just preventing future harm like antinatalism does. It directly advocates for the active termination of existing lives, viewing this paradoxically as the highest form of suffering reduction.
Understanding the logic behind it, even if you vehemently disagree with the conclusion, is a powerful exercise, isn't it? It forces you to confront the logical implications of a worldview where suffering is the only absolute that matters.
Agreed. It pushes boundaries.
So we'll leave you, our listener, with this final thought, building on that clash we just discussed. If reducing suffering is something we almost universally agree is a moral good, at what precise point does philosophical logic, that cold, rational confusion that ending life definitely ends suffering, cross the line from compassionate reduction into, well, existential annihilation?
A very fine line, if it exists.
And what does this profound conflict between that kind of pure logic and our deeply ingrained human instinct for survival tell us about the fundamental, maybe non-negotiable value we assign to life itself, even when that life involves pain?
A difficult balance to strike, indeed.
Something to reflect on. Keep wrestling with these difficult distinctions, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.